Yes. Right.
All right, we are going to go ahead and get started. So, welcome to today's Careers in the Arts. We are going to learn about careers in museums, and you guys are very lucky that you have three amazing people that I actually personally know all of them. We actually all worked together back at the Golisano Children's Museum of Naples many, just a few years ago, we'll say. But we've all moved on into many different careers, and I'm very fortunate to have learned a lot from all of them, and they're just amazing people. So I'm going to start off with having each of them introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about themselves, and then we just have a series of questions. And yeah, we're going to go from there. So Andy, I'm going to have you start with yourself. Who are you, and where are you currently working?
My name is Andy Marquart, and I am currently the Chief Executive Officer at the EdVenture Children's Museum in Columbia, South Carolina.
Awesome. Carrie.
Hi, I am Carrie Cutchens. I am a curator and deputy director of the JFK Special Warfare Museum, which is part of the U.S. Army Museum System.
Excellent. And then Lindsay.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Huban. I'm the Chief Content and Integration Officer at the United States Olympic and Paralympic Museum in Colorado Springs.
Excellent. So I worked with all of them down in Naples, Florida, but you can see that they have traveled far and wide. As is very frequent in the museum world, you do move around a lot in the museum world. So next question. A lot of
Sorry.
people think that, oh, and I'm going to go ahead and actually mute everybody right now. We're going to keep questions till the end, just so we can get through all the questions. So next question that I have for you guys is, a lot of people think that when you work in a museum, you either just work with objects and we sit around and we work with things all day. But my experience working in museums is not necessarily that. So what do people think you do all day? And then what do you actually do all day? Like, what's a typical day for you? If there is a typical day, and if there isn't a typical day, like, what do you normally do? What's a lot of your typical duties? So, Carrie, I'm going to have you start with this one.
Okay, people think we just play with objects all day. Um, wow, that's one of my answers as to why I love museum work is because you don't have to do the same thing every day. Working in a museum, you get things thrown at you all the time. And so you may have your whole day planned out, and then all of a sudden, you get an email or a phone call, and your whole day has changed. So I give tours. I write tour content. As part of my museum, we educate our soldiers who are going through specific courses. So I do a lot of educational content. I'm also the purchaser, so I do a lot of, I hold the museum's credit card, so I do a lot of that kind of stuff. I mentor and help guide our volunteers and interns. I do work with objects. I do exhibit design, installation. We do a lot of outreach through different units and things. So I do offsite exhibits. Could be any one of those things or all of them in the same day.
I love that you talked about mentoring because we're definitely going to talk a lot
Mhm,
about mentoring in a little bit because I think that's so important in the museum
mhm,
world and actually in all careers in the arts, but really in the museum world, it's so
mhm.
important. So, Lindsay, what do you feel like your job is on a regular day? And it's not just going to Italy for the Olympics, which I know you just got back from.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know that I have a typical day. I oversee all the content in and outside of the museum. So it could be handling artifacts or writing text or planning for a new offsite exhibit. I may be reaching out to athletes to say, hey, congratulations on that gold medal. Can I borrow your skis? So it really changes all the time, which is
Yep.
great. It's what I was hoping for. There's a lot of opportunities to be creative. There's a lot of opportunities to try new things. And that's what I wanted. And the perk of my job is that I did just get to spend 3 weeks in Italy at the Olympics.
And she got to hold the Olympic torch numerous times and hand it to people, which was very cool. So then, Andy, what about your job? What do you do as the executive director? Is it just asking for money?
Yeah, well, that's part of it, right? But I think what it comes down to for me, if you just pare it down to a daily thing, it's three things. It's people, it's planning, and it's decision making. And I would say that typically takes up the majority of the day, although, I could be having lunch with a state representative or trying to get money from a donor or any number of things. But for the majority, it's the day, and I think Carrie put it really well. Like you can't plan your day. Like I have what I need to do today, but um, when you walk in the building, it could be any number of things. And I think what I like to do is make sure that the folks that report to me directly are feel empowered and like they can go out and make decisions. But my head is in 9 months from now when it comes to planning. We're always like 3 quarters ahead. What are we doing then? Because it gets here before you know it. And then if you're making decisions for yourself and the organization in 9 months, the day to day becomes a lot easier. Unless the world's on fire, which we all know how that looks, in various capacities. And then you are living moment to moment and day to day. But, and at the end, you're making decisions for the whole organization. So you have to think about fairness. You have to think about, is it the best thing for the organization rather than the best thing for so and so?
And I know that can be really challenging with funding, especially when you are at the top, because you are dealing with, when you're every year you're trying to figure out your budget. And when you are getting funding from your state, you're figuring out, okay, we're doing our budget this year and we don't know where the funding is going to come from next year. And that can be really frustrating. So, and I don't know the answer to the next one. So I'm really interested to hear this. Even though I know all three of you, I'm interested to hear the answer to this. How did you get interested in the museum field? So, a lot of people I know fall into the museum career. So I'm interested to see how you got interested in the museum field. So Lindsay, I'm going to send this over to you. How did you get interested in working in a museum?
Uh, I, as a kid, I loved museums growing up, and we would go to museums on vacation. And every town we went to, we would go to the museum. And somehow it never occurred to me that that was a career path. I don't know why that never crossed my mind. So I went to graduate school to become a history professor and really enjoyed learning and really enjoyed working with students and hated book reviews and was never going to write a dissertation because it felt like I would just be doing homework for the rest of my life. So I've sort of looked around and said, okay, well, what do I do instead? How do I keep the parts that I really like and not have to do the parts that I don't? And museums were a perfect fit. So I guess I'm one of those that sort of fell into it. An internship at the American Red Cross, working in their history and education programs that then turned into a job when my supervisor left. And it was like a light bulb went on that, hey, I can do all these fun parts and still go home at the end of the day and not have homework. So, and that was, I guess, almost 20 years ago somehow.
Andy, how about you? How did you get interested in the museum world?
Well, it all started when I was a terrible student. And
Okay.
literally just was not, I didn't gravitate towards formal learning in school, but I certainly gravitated towards informal learning outside of the classroom, and kind of like what Lindsay was saying, I loved visiting museums. I loved going to state parks and national parks. And I thought for sure I'd just be like this reclusive park ranger one day, showing people plants. But then the first job I got out of college was a volunteer coordinator position at a local science center, and the rest is history. I just really loved it and just kept going from there.
And then Carrie?
Mine's a little different. I actually didn't grow up going to museums. We went like to the local museum, the Edison home, and third grade type thing. So I came at it a lot later. I was actually in college for photography. I was in photography school, and I had one instructor who required us to go to one museum a week and just write a one-page review of whatever they were showing. Didn't matter the type of museum, art, science, history, whatever. And through that exercise, through the semester, I got exposed to a lot of different museums and started looking beyond photography, saying, hey, this could be something I want to do. I got interested in, how do they choose what went on the display, those kinds of things. So as I started looking more to finish my bachelor, that's how I went to it and just took a guess that I would love it, and I still love it. So it was a
And you
good
still
guess.
love
Yeah.
it. Awesome. All right, so Andy already answered this question. So girls, it's going to go to you then. So, what was your first job in a museum, and was it paid or volunteer, and how did you get it? And I am going to bring up something personal because I still think this is the best response I've ever gotten. So, when I first met Carrie, we were working at the Children's Museum, and we were building the Children's Museum. So I'm the fourth person who worked there, and Carrie came in to volunteer, and we weren't ready to hire a curator yet. And she said basically that I'm going to volunteer here, and I'm going to make myself so needed that you're going to just have to hire me. And she
Yep.
did. We had to hire her because she was just so amazing. So that's what I'm really interested in is like your first job. Was it something that you were just like hired right into, or did you volunteer and then eventually get paid into your job? So Andy, I know you got paid into your first job. But Carrie, your first job in a museum, was it a volunteer job or a paid job? And what was it?
Paid.
Okay.
So my first, I guess technically was my 3 month internship as part of my degree program, and that was actually paid. I was very lucky for being in the 90s. I was very lucky. It wasn't very much. But my first professional museum job, um, my mom saw an ad in the newspaper. It was actually for the Collier County History Museum, the Collier County Museum. And I was living in Utah, and this was back in Florida at the time. And I applied, and I found out later, after I was hired, that the director there had taken my resume along with others and given it to a exhibit designer they worked with and asked her for her opinion. And she looked at him and said, "Oh, well, this one studied under Alvin Gerhardt, who was my main professor in college. So she's going to know what she's doing." So I got hired based on that recommendation, and was there for about a year and a half before I left for the Army. Yeah.
That's awesome.
And I must say, I was paid $27,000. That was my first salary. And I don't think they've improved a whole lot.
Yeah, that does bring up a point that I will say museum positions are not always the best paid positions.
Yep.
Like I always tell people who are interested in the museum world is that you will be able to eat, but it might be ramen with some chicken. Maybe not steak, but ramen with chicken. Lindsay, what about your first job in a museum? Was it paid, unpaid, and how did you get it?
It was definitely unpaid,
And I'm
but
sorry, it seems like my internet is not great right
no, I can still hear you okay, but your video gets a little glitchy sometimes. But my first job was unpaid, but I'm pretty sure I was getting course credit for it. It was that internship at the American Red Cross. Um, and then so I know I was volunteering. I think I was getting course credit, and then when my supervisor transferred to a different line of service at the Red Cross, her position was open, and I mean, I applied and interviewed and did all the things, but I sort of slid into it that way.
All right. So next question. One of the things that I've found in museums is that a lot of us, we get jobs, and then to move up in our career, a lot of times we end up having to move to another place. So a lot of times people end up in a museum and they stay for a long time, like kind of stay in that career forever. So how many different museum jobs have you had? Where have they been? And have you had to move cities to move up in your career? So, Andy, we're going to go back to you for this one. So, like, how many different jobs have you had, and have you had to actually move around to move up in your career? And where have you
Yeah.
been?
I'll try to keep it brief. I have been in Missouri, Arkansas, Florida, Tennessee, and now South Carolina. The only non-executive director or CEO level job I had was in Missouri. And so my career has progressed through various science museums and children's museums, the rest of the way through? And the answer is absolutely yes. If you reach, and I think Carrie and Lindsay both know this, you have to, well, and obviously you do too, Jen, but I mean, you have to be willing to relocate. And if you have a bit of wanderlust, it really helps, right? Like, because it's fun to learn and be part of new communities and everything. And sometimes it's hard to leave them as well. But yeah, it's been quite the journey, and it's been interesting, and you get to kind of hone in your skills more, and you get to learn because every place does things differently. Every community works with you differently, and it just helps strengthen your experience as you move along.
And Carrie, yours is a little bit different because you are now in the federal government system and in the
Hmm.
Army system. How does that work with you? Because I know you went from the private system into the federal government system. So tell us a little bit about how it was in the private system and then
Yeah.
how it is in the federal government system now for
So
you.
this is, I'm currently in my fifth position. My first one was the Collier County Museum. So I went from Florida to Texas. Because after I left Florida the first time, the Collier County, I actually joined the Army. Then once I got out of the Army is when I went to work for the Army as a civilian. And that job was in Texas. And then I moved to Alabama to move up because in the federal system, the way your I guess your rating is your job level. Sometimes it's hard to upgrade that position to a higher position when it's occupied. So you have to move to whoever's got the next higher level. So that's what I did. I moved to Alabama and took a position there. And then that's when I left the federal system again and went to the Children's Museum of Naples and was there. And then when I left the Children's Museum, I came back to the federal system, and I've been here for now almost 10 years. Um, it's different. Our funding is different, so it's very different in a lot of ways. The work is the same. You still work with artifacts. You're still writing labels. You're still working with the public. You're still doing research. All of that is still the same. It's just the management and admin is different.
In the federal system,
Mhm.
would you need to apply for another position to move, or would they tell you to move to a different position?
It could be either. um, Most of the time, you apply. You see it advertised. All of the Army museums fall under the what they call the U.S. Army Center of Military History.
Mhm.
So there'll be jobs all over the place. Could be there's I don't even know how many Army museums there are anymore. Currently, with the drawdown of the federal government, where they're reducing the size of the federal government, it can come up where they if there's a position that has to be eliminated, they may offer to move you to another. So it can kind of go both ways, but the second way is very rare, doesn't normally happen.
Got it. And then, Lindsay, how about you? How many museum jobs have you had and where have they all been?
I am on my fourth museum. The first one was in DC at the American Red Cross, and then moved from there to Naples for the Children's Museum, and then moved from there to Tampa, where I was at the Henry Plant Museum on the campus of the University of Tampa. And I was there for 10 years, and that one's a little interesting because I did move up 3 times there. And then after 10 years and 2 years as the executive director, I took a vacation to Colorado and spent 2 weeks out here and got back to Florida and said, okay, it's time to move again. And so I've been here at the Olympic and Paralympic Museum for about 18 months.
And that's not quite typical to necessarily move up in your current museum. Like,
Mm-hmm.
it's not atypical, but it's not quite as frequent where you
Yeah.
actually move up. A lot of times you're moving to another place to move up in your career. I feel that it is then to necessarily move into the executive director position. I think it's because your old executive director was leaving, you became the interim, and then you
Mm-hmm.
became the permanent. But you were in the search. You didn't just get that position. It was a full search.
It was a national search that took a year to complete. It was a very long process.
Yeah. All right. So this is Vegas, but it is going to be on YouTube. So just FYI. What do you like most about working in the museum field? And on the flip side, if there was something you could change about this industry, what would it be? And you can't say money. Anything other than money.
salaries. That would be my
Yeah,
first.
you can't say money. You have to say something other than that. So since Carrie
Okay.
just answered, what do you like most about working in this field, and what would you change if you could?
But I've always said that what I like most about working in museums is that I don't have to do the same thing every day. It's not clock in and you know do the same thing repetitive every day. It's if I get in and hey, you know what? I don't want to talk to anybody. I'm going to go work in the collection storage room. I can do that. There's always something that needs to be done. I think over the years, one thing I think I would change about the industry is the trend that overeducated the lower museum positions. Because now it's not uncommon for you to need to have a master's or multiple masters in order to get an entry level collections manager or collect, and that to me is a big disservice to people because I was one that came up with only an undergrad degree in museum studies and worked my way through and up the ladder, so to speak. I still don't have a master's degree, but I haven't needed it. The collections work, I don't think, unless you're specializing into something like conservation or administration, your role is administration, that's different. But for entry level, I don't like the trend that you have to have this higher level degree just to get your foot in the door.
I do agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
Lindsay, how about yourself? What do you like best about the museum world, and what do you think? What would you change if you could?
Both of Carrie's answers were excellent, and I agree with them. I think the thing that I like best, aside from getting to do something different every day, is that I feel like so often I change someone's mind about museums, that they think museums are dusty, boring, old places. And they come here, they come to any of the museums that I've worked at, and by the end of their visit, they're sold that museums are awesome and that you can learn something new every day that you go, every museum that you go to. And I love getting to make that connection with people and getting to see them get excited about the museums. For what I would change, I know you said not money, and this is money adjacent. That I wish that institutions could be, I guess, more independent, that you weren't always having to think about funding, and this is a great program, wait, how are we going to pay for it? I wish that, so maybe financial stability, maybe that's a better way of putting it.
Or multi-year funding. Give us the money and then tell us that we can have it for 10 years instead of
and general operating money.
Yes.
Yes. We still need to pay for lights and toilet paper. Andy, how about you? What do you like best, and what do you wish you could change?
I think I'll just sort of layer on the answer. The variety is what's great, and the impact and what we do and the results of our work every day. If you want to go see the result of your work, you can just get out of your office and go on the floor, watch a field trip, watch a family. But I also just think the variety of people that you get to work with. And, I think until you're in a huge place where you have 10 curators and that's kind of your circle, you usually have one or two, and then you have one or two marketing people, you have your education people, you have your finance folks. And what's beautiful is when they're all bought in to your work, and these are folks with different backgrounds, different perspectives, different ideas, but they can all come together and row in the same direction for a common purpose. I think that that's one of my favorite things day in and day out is watching all these, committed individuals take their talents and make it work for what we do every day. As far as what I would change the perception of our work too. I mean, I think when people think about, especially in a science museum and maybe even more particularly in a children's museum, it's sort of like, oh, you get to go play all day. You get to go have fun all day. Or and it's like, nope, we run a business. And that business is sometimes anywhere between $1 million in revenue or $1 million business, or it's $100 million, depending on the institution. And you're held accountable to the community, you're held accountable to your board of trustees. And nobody thinks about widget making, right? Like, oh, I sell tires or I do this or and that's considered, oh yeah, you must have a tough job. But then when you get into our work, it's like, oh, you get to have fun or you get to, and that's one thing I would like to see change is just the perception of our work and what we do and that we all are doing, whether it's preservation or um, education from an interactive exhibit standpoint, it's still a very important and viable business that I think just people, if they sat in any one of our seats, they would be lost, right? If they were doing
Yeah.
any other work, and um, so yeah, I think that's what I would change is just the overall perception of our work and what we do, and that plays into this common theme that we've talked about since we've began this conversation is the pay. And I think our industry has gotten better, at least since I've been in it this is my 22nd year in the museum field. And I think it's gotten a lot better. But I think that's part of it and probably nonprofit in general and anything in the arts, you're going to have that, um, barrier because people aren't investing in it mentally the same way they would in something else. And so then therefore, well, then the pay is not there either. And I think that those two things are kind of tied together.
So I think, Carrie, you're the one who brought this up before, and I want to come back to it. So I think mentoring plays a huge role in museum careers. And I feel like I can 100% look back on people that I've worked with in the past and think of them as mentors for me in my career. Um, and so I'd like you guys to take a second and think back to your careers and think about who you would think of was a mentor to you in your careers. And what did they teach you, good and bad? But what did they teach you along the way in your careers? And how did you find them as a mentor? Like, was it just a natural, they were maybe your supervisor? Did you actually search out a mentor? And how would a student with a disability who's interested in going into a museum career, or an adult with a disability who's interested in going into a career in a museum, how would they go about finding a mentor in the museum field? So that was kind of like a multi-pronged question. But so first, think about yourself, any mentors that you had, how you found them. Were they your supervisor, or did you actually like search out somebody? And then second question is somebody who is interested in going into one of these fields, any advice that you have on how they could go about finding a mentor? So two separate areas there. So Lindsay, I'm going to go ahead and have you start off with that.
Okay, great. I just wrote down some notes.
She's like, no, I was writing.
Uh, so over my career, I've jumped around a lot. I've had pretty much every different job in a museum that you can have. So I have found mentors in different ways throughout my career. I think the one that I worked with the longest was Cynthia Zinneber, who was the previous director at the Henry Plant Museum. She gave me a chance, brought me in as a volunteer manager and communications person, and then gave me opportunities to grow and to develop. And whenever I would have a performance review with her, she would always start it with, how can I help you more? What opportunities are you missing? And that was just so powerful. I never thought about that before having those conversations with her. And as for individuals with disabilities who may want to get into this field, I will say that I personally have never turned somebody down who's reached out and said, hey, can I talk to you about your career? Do you have 20 minutes for a Zoom call? Can we meet for coffee? Anything like that. I've never said no. So I think just reaching out is the best way to do it. I have found professionals in this field to be so welcoming all the time. And if my role and what I do doesn't line up that well with what you're doing, I know a lot of people in this field, and I'm going to put you in touch with somebody else who may be a better fit. I also think a great place to start is professional organizations. The Florida Association of Museums is fantastic. And you meet so many great people there, and there are student rates for conferences and memberships. And getting involved with professional organizations is a great way to meet people who either are part of a professional mentor or not professional, an established mentor program, or who are willing to introduce you to someone who might be willing to become a mentor.
I think that's a great point too, is that the museum world, although there's a lot of museums, it is a very small community. I feel like everybody seems to know everybody else. I joke, I went and back when there was an IMLS, I was reviewing for them up in DC, and I sat at the table and there were 6 of us on this panel, and 5 of us, I was connected to 4 of the other people. I was like, oh wait, we worked at the same museum. I did my internship with you. You and I went to the same grad school program. And I was like, my God, this is really weird. There's only one person that I wasn't connected to. So it is a very small community. And I think you're right. A lot of people, especially if you say, I'm not looking for you to hire me. I just want to know more about X, or like, can I get you, can I take you out for coffee one day? And if you're willing to work with their schedule, because everybody's super busy, I think a lot of people will be like, oh yeah, I'll grab a coffee or do a Zoom with you or something like that, if you're flexible with their timing. Especially if you say, I'm not looking for you to hire me, because most of the time they're going to say, I don't have any money to hire anybody right now. But yeah, they're going to be willing to meet with you and tell you, because we also all love talking about what we do. All right, so Andy, that moves on to you. Who were your mentors, and how did you find them? And then what advice would you have?
You know, I think it's really hard for me to answer this question because it's hard for me to narrow down anecdotally how many people have influenced me, and how many people I could just literally text or reach out to and just even bounce ideas off of. So the way I wanted to frame this one was, first of all, I think you always need a mentor, in this business, because things constantly change. And even if you think you know what you're doing, you probably don't. And so, you have to, and that's perfectly healthy. I always talk about the inverse relationship between confidence and experience. It's like this, right? They start here. And when you're starting out in your career, your confidence is way up here and your experience is down here. And then as you move forward, they kind of move inverse of each other. And so, the more experience you get, like the less confidence you get, because you know everything that can go wrong, or you might know that there's 5 different answers to a question rather than, oh, I'm going to go do this. And I think to get to that point, you have to have people that are willing to, open up and share with you. And what I will leave this question with is, I remember my first museum job, and I was a volunteer coordinator, and then I became the museum manager. So I was running the floor and guest services, and I used to always think, man, those folks upstairs, they don't know what it's like. I don't, what are they making that decision for and everything else? And I would question it all the time. And then when I started this role, well, guess who I called? The executive director at my first museum, and she would answer, and I would say, "How did you navigate this?" And oh, by the way, I'm really sorry for whatever I questioned that you did, because I know exactly what you're going through now. But I think I was able, just through connections, and I think the fact that we are in a very um, it is a very small world, the museum world. And so the fact that you can make connections and get mentors as you continue to grow your career, that has never been a problem. And I don't think it will be in our industry. It's just a very, like Lindsay was saying, it's a very open community. It's a very supportive community. From my perspective, when somebody walks in the door, and wants to be part of what we do, we try to give them every tool that they need to succeed. And it's not just about how can you benefit EdVenture, it's how can we set you up to be a museum professional moving on after this opportunity. And that when we frame it that way, it tells the employee that we're supporting them in their career and what they want to do, but also I think it eliminates any other doubt about how we want to support people internally, right? And so you can come in with any number of backgrounds and experiences, but when you're here, you're going to grow as a museum professional. And I think that's something I've always carried with me wherever I go.
And I will say that Andy was definitely one of my mentors, because he was our executive director at one point. And when I became an executive director for the first time, and I had some of those, like, I don't know how to deal with this. And I would call him and be like, dude, how do you deal with this? And he would be like, okay, calm down. Let me tell you how I've dealt with this. So I definitely called him a couple times with no, really, how do you deal with this when this happens? And I also think one of the points that Lindsay brought up of having a manager who in your performance evaluation is like, how do you want to grow? I think that really happens a lot in the museum world. I know I've always done that with my employees of being like, okay, great, here's what you're doing great. How can I help you grow to the next level? Because I think as a supervisor, we are always wanting our employees to continue to grow. And some people want to stay in their positions and they don't want to move on. And that's great. But people who do want to move on in their careers, we want to give them the tools that they need to be able to move on. And I always see it as like the biggest compliment when one of my employees is like, you were a coordinator and you've moved on to a manager position somewhere else. I wasn't able to hire you as a manager because I don't have a position open, but you got a job as a manager somewhere else and I helped you get that job. And I feel like I've done my job. Now I have to hire a new person and that's not great, but I've helped you move on into that role. All right, Carrie, so who would you consider a mentor and what would you, advice would you give somebody for finding a mentor?
I think it's kind of a combination of what Lindsay and Andy have already said. I did find my professor that I studied under was a mentor of mine for a long time. Would call him and bounce things off of him, and he was always gracious. But like Andy said, or maybe you did. It's you can call anybody that you know, and often people you don't know in other institutions. If there's something, especially I found it in history museums. Like, hey, I don't have this in my collection, or I don't know about this. I found this. And this has happened to us, where somebody has found an item that we have in our collection online. Hey, what do you know about yours? There's always information sharing, so it's pretty easy to find somebody to help you in just about anything you need in the museum world. Um, my current supervisor, our director, is probably my biggest mentor now. She's been in the industry she's been in the federal government in the museum world for over 45 years.
Wow.
So as I've learned to navigate the federal system, she has been tremendously helpful and bringing me up and understanding how it's going to be if I ever do become a director in a federal museum. Lots of things to consider. And I think Lindsay's answer for where to find a mentor, that the professional associations, I think most of them now have mentorship programs too. So that was originally going to be my answer, was to also look at the professional associations. But again, I don't think many people would turn somebody down if they were to get a cold call and say, hey, I'm interested in museum work. How do I do this? I mean, I've answered that question probably 100 times in my career. So I think they're both answers are good.
Carrie, I'm gonna have you take this one next too.
Okay.
All right. So, what accommodations have you seen being used by museum staff and volunteers with disabilities? I know when we've talked in the past, you said that you've had Army soldiers sometimes who, I believe you said that Army soldiers who are currently on disability come in and work at the museum, correct?
We do. We have some retirees. We do have, well, not at this museum, but at the First Cavalry Division Museum I
Yep.
was at, we would have soldiers who were actually injured during the global war on terrorism. They would back and still active duty, but they needed a job, and so they would come to the museum and they would work in whatever capacity they could.
So what
Sometimes it's
accommodations have you seen in your museum world, in your museum worlds, both in the Army museums, also any other museums you've worked, have you seen people use, and have you found that museums are generally welcoming to staff and volunteers with disabilities? And how would you, if somebody was interested in some type
Mhm,
of career in the museums and they had a
mhm.
disability, what advice would you give them for asking for like some type of accommodation?
Well, it's different in the federal world, but I can give it kind of an example. We currently have we had a volunteer and he's deaf, and we had never worked or had a volunteer who was completely deaf before.
Mhm.
So it was a bit of a challenge to understand how we're going to communicate it's actually beautiful. And he's one that had a degree in military history. He's always wanted to work in a military museum. And once he started volunteering with us, we communicate. He's really good at reading lips. He can speak, but personality wise, he understands, like, hey, I didn't get that. I didn't understand what you said. He'll put his finger up and he types it out. And we use his phone a lot, like voice to text. So you speak and he'll read his phone. So we've made it work. I mean, it's not really an accommodation to us. It's just how we communicate with him. And
How did he tell you he wanted to communicate that way? Did he just like tell you
just
right to
through
you that this is
email. He actually lived a couple hours away, and we were just one of the museums he had reached out to. And me and my coworker, another curator, we talked and said, he just communicated through email that, oh, by the way, I'm deaf. And we were like, okay, so we'll figure it out. We didn't know if we were going to be writing on whiteboards or what. He shows up and says, nope, this is basically explain to us how we can communicate with him. And that's what we did. And there's no issues, there's no impediment to it. We just, we work with him. And he's one that I was thinking of, is because now he's getting a second master's degree in museum studies, because he wants to work in a military museum so badly, and he just wasn't getting the response with just a history degree. So he's currently doing a distance learning program, and he's actually coming back to the museum this summer to do his internship for his program. Yeah, so we're going to welcome him back with open arms. For the museum, we work with whoever. I mean, like I said, we'd never turn anybody away. It would just be a conversation on what can we do to make this work.
Andy, what about you? What type of accommodations have you had with staff and volunteers? And also, do you think museums are welcoming to guests and staff and volunteers that have disabilities? And what advice would you give for students or people who are looking for jobs in the field for asking for accommodations?
So first, I would say I don't know of a museum that would not be willing to accommodate a volunteer or staff person. I think it's kind of in the fabric of our work to begin with. I mean, most museums are extremely interested in inclusion, whether that's staff, volunteers, or even visitors, right? So I think I'll use an example like Carrie did. I mean, we had an employee apply last year, and she's in a wheelchair. And the first thing that happens is the HR comes to me and says, we have this employee in a wheelchair. We need, it wasn't a question of anything other than what do we need to do, because she was qualified. And we thought it would be a good experience for us. So we actually said, you're hired, but also do an audit for us. Tell us what it's like working here while you're in a wheelchair, because we'd really love to know how we can accommodate people in the future. Because, when you have this conversation, you kind of step into the legal realm too, right? Like we have to do certain things, but it doesn't mean we're good at it, right? Like everybody knows everybody knows that for wheelchair accessibility, it's 36 inches, but is that really accessible? And so she did a wonderful job just saying, look, if you guys thought about this, and there was things we never ever would have thought about, just where our swipe badge locations are, or which way a door opens. I mean, those are afterthoughts, but it wasn't for her. So she let us know, and we made some pretty good changes around the museum to accommodate somebody in the future as well. And so I think that's good. And I think, as far as asking or what to do if you need accommodations, it's just be upfront. Especially at the very beginning, like, we can't do much if we don't know. And some people who need accommodations, it's not readily noticeable. And so, again, we kind of dip into the legal side of things with that, but from just in the spirit of doing things right by your employees and your team, whether they be volunteer or staff, we can only do as much as you tell us what you need. And so it's really important that people are just upfront from the beginning. And I think in our business, at least, I think everyone will do whatever they can to accommodate a team member.
I think also because when we've gotten to the point where we want to hire you, we don't want to have to find another person. When we're excited to hire you, we want to do everything to get you on board. Please don't make us find another person. Just tell us what you need so we can
Mhm.
make it happen. So
Oh,
Lindsay,
I
I
will
know.
jump. Oh, I was going to say I was going to come back and give an example too. Our volunteer did the same thing. We have an intro video when you come into the museum. It's like a minute and a half long or whatever. It talks about the different units we cover or whatever. We didn't have captioning on it. Never, just didn't think about it for whatever reason. And when this volunteer came, I was like, hey, we did the same thing Andy mentioned is what changes can we make? What can we do better? We know we're not great at things, so please help us. And that was one of the things he mentioned is, hey, closed captions would be great. So
He's,
easy fix.
he's like, there's a video there. I don't know what you're saying.
I have
So
no idea what's going on. Yeah.
So, Lindsay, I know you are in a little bit of a different position because you are at the Olympic and Paralympic Museum. So, accessibility is definitely key to your museum. So, I'm going to ask you this question, and then I'm also going to ask you first the next question as well. So, first, this one, which is the accommodations you've seen for your museum staff and volunteers, and how you guys make your museum welcoming, and any advice you'd have for people who need to ask for an accommodation. And then I'm also going to ask you the next one after that.
Well, over my career, I've worked with volunteers with disabilities, and we've provided different accommodations, whether it's screen readers or larger text, or we had a volunteer who was deaf who was working in our museum store, and so her preference was for a list of common questions so people could point to the question and she could give them the answer. I've worked with contractors with disabilities. Matt Weimuller, who Jen, I know that he is a fantastic jazz saxophone player who would perform at my last museum regularly. And so it was just, again, that conversation, what do you need? Okay, we'll provide it and done. Here at the Olympic and Paralympic Museum, we're in a brand new building that was built to be this museum. And while the museum was being planned out, there were lots of conversations with Olympians, with Paralympians. What do you need? What parts of your story do we need to tell? And all of that sort of came together so that the museum itself has accessibility baked into it from the beginning. It's all ramps to get through the museum where it's a 3-story building that has 11 levels in it. So if you're in a wheelchair or you have a mobility disability, you never have to leave your party. You stay with your party the whole time. Everybody has the same experience coming through. All of our videos had closed captions and ASL interpretation on them. When you first come to the museum, you get an RFID badge, and then you go over to a computer and you input what accommodations you need as a visitor. So it's all baked in from the very beginning. And we actually have a staff member who is a Paralympian who's in a wheelchair, and she just does her job. The building, we are so lucky that the building was designed to be accessible from the very beginning. And this is not always the case. My last museum was a historic hotel that opened in 1891. And so we didn't have any of that there. So you just figure it out.
My internet is not going very well, so I know I skipped out for a second. I'm hopefully back. So yes, I got most of that. But yes, Lindsay's museum is very special because it was built with such accessibility in mind. And that goes right into the next question, which is many older museums. I think we've all been to a lot of older museums. They were built prior to the ADA. And for those of you who are watching this on YouTube, the ADA is Americans with Disabilities Act. And so before things had to be accessible to people with disabilities. How accessible have some of the museums you've been to or that you've worked at in the past, and how have
You froze, Jen.
Seems to be kind of frozen. I do have the list of questions that we were sent in advance pulled up, so I'm gonna just
There you go.
read the rest of that. Do you feel that museums are welcoming to staff and volunteers with disabilities? What advice would you give to a student to help them ask for an accommodation? So the museum that I'm working at right now is obviously the most accessible of any that I've worked at in my career. The one that was the most challenging was the Henry Plant Museum in Tampa because it was a historic building. But since we were on the campus of a university, there were already a lot of accommodations for physical disabilities already built in, ramps, and we were all on one floor and there were no stairs and that sort of thing. I think museums are very welcoming, at least in my experience. Museums have always been very welcoming to staff and volunteers with disabilities because we are places of inclusion. We want you to come, we want you to have a positive experience, whether you're a visitor, a staff member, or a volunteer. And for what advice to give to a student to help them ask for an accommodation, I imagine that can be a really difficult conversation to have. I think it could be intimidating to have to ask for an accommodation. So I think that kind of goes back to our conversation about mentors. If you have a relationship with somebody there, don't be afraid to ask for what you need. That's part of most jobs is if you need something to help you be successful, you ask for it, whether it's, a new computer or a screen reader or a different handle on the door because it's a knob and you have difficulty turning it. So whatever it may be, you just ask for it. And if you're nervous, enlist your mentor's help, have a practice conversation and run through it a couple times until you feel comfortable and confident with it.
I'm sorry that my internet was going down again. I changed routers. It's tired. I changed routers. Hopefully this will work. Okay. So the next question was, some museums that are in older buildings were built prior to the ADA. So without naming names, I know we've all visited different museums and we've probably seen things where we're like, yeah, that's not very accessible for people with disabilities. Hopefully we haven't worked in some of those museums, but have you personally helped address any accessibility issues? I know you were already starting to talk about some of this, Lindsay, but at any of your previous museums, have you helped address any accessibility issues? I know, Andy, at the museum you were in Tennessee, I think you told me you had some challenges with some accessibility because you were in a couple different buildings that weren't necessarily the most accessible. They were some historic challenges. So if you could just talk a little bit about if you were able to address any of those challenges. And then Carrie, I know since you've been on bases before, I'm sure you've had some challenges with accessibility. Have you been able to address any of those? So just if you've had any challenges with accessibility, and then if you've actually been able to address any of those, that's kind of the question for this one. So Andy, I'm going to throw this one to you first.
Yeah, you're right, Jen. The museum I was at in Tennessee, and I guess this goes back to, there are historical sites that obviously have not only accessibility issues, but that, sometimes laws prohibit,
You can't change them.
yeah, with there are ways, but usually they're expensive, but you can't like remove a stairwell, right? Like and replace it with like an elevator. So those are one set of challenges. The other side of that is some of the buildings that museums are in was cheap real estate. So because they were older or they're in a district that's getting redeveloped. And so, before, that's the way museums look at it. And before ADA, like there was just different sets of priorities, right? The museum I was at in Tennessee had no accessibility to our bottom floor. There were stairs only. There was no ramp. There was just, so think about it, not only from an accessibility standpoint, but even moms with strollers have a hard time going into the basement, or the bottom level of that museum. Those are huge challenges, but I think the ultimate solution is the facility right then, right? Is it the place that you want to be in? So outside of the historical context, which you're there to preserve a historical landmark, and so you work with what you can. The option for us was, do we spend $10 million to retrofit the current space, or do we move? And we moved. So we went to a new location. We collaborated with the university and ended up co-locating with another museum. And it worked out really well, just from a very serendipitous square footage need and just what the kind of the puzzle pieces fit really well in that situation. But I remember one of the things that was on the bottom level of our previous location was the art studio. Um, and so, I mean, if you had no way to get down there, you never experienced the art studio. And I remember in the new location when we opened the art studio, it was a completely ADA accessible building. Everything was very well designed and very well done. But I remember the first time a child in a wheelchair went into our art museum, and I was like, it just kind of hit me. I'm like, that would have never ever happened at our previous location. And this is somebody who had been to our previous location, but really never got to experience what we had to offer there. So, yeah, I just feel like there's different reasons for accessibility issues, but I don't think anybody would want to live with them in our industry, right? So we're always trying to find solutions, and there are solutions, but it's usually they require funding, or they require a completely different location or perspective on what is needed and what people need. So yeah, it was serendipitous the way it worked out. But like I said, but yeah, that was pretty challenging at the beginning there with the way the
So,
building was laid out.
so when people say think outside the box for a solution, Andy was like, I'm going to think outside the building. I'm just going to take the
Just go to
entire
a different
museum,
location. Yeah.
just move the whole museum. Okay, that's a good
Yeah.
way of, okay. But it did solve the problem. So, Carrie, what about you?
Well, like I've worked in a couple of different historical buildings, and one in Texas was in a World War II era building. So they
A little
had
before the ADA.
retrofitted with yeah with ramps and such, but it wasn't completely accessible. The building I'm in now is when I first started this museum in 2016, they were moving into this building, and they were currently, it's just an old, ugly army building on an army post. They were putting in ramps and such to make the building accessible. There are still like our main offices that are not accessible. They have not put a ramp, but in those cases, we go to our visitors if needed. Um, but all of our galleries and all are completely accessible. When we did make some tweaks, like when they ran one ramp, we have they had a like a window unit, an air unit that was sticking out and had a cage around it, and you're like, yeah, you have to move this because it's right in the path. And like these people are just gonna knock their heads on it. So it was some obvious things. um, making sure that our bathrooms were going to be accessible. There's things that sometimes in the military they don't always forward think that way. They don't think in the terms of having public access and visitors coming
Mhm.
and what are we going to do. And so we try to accommodate as best we can if there's something that's not there or not available. Like I said, we come to them if somebody needs to meet in our privately or something. We have another room available, or conference room that is accessible. So we just have to make it work, because the building we're in, although not historical, it is old and had to be fitted for things. So one thing we did do is, and this just kind of fell in our lap, is we partnered with the local Lions organization, and they donated Enchroma glasses for those who can't see color. So that was, like I said, just something that happened, and we're the only Army museum that has those available. Um, so that's just one thing that we have available that's just minor, but it was really cool when we were able to do that.
So if a young person with a disability was interested in a job in a museum, what advice would you give them? And I'm going to start with Andy.
My advice would just to be, like I said earlier, upfront, but also don't let that get in the way of what you want to do for a career, because as you've heard, the theme throughout this conversation has been about the support and the community and the the idea that if somebody wants to be part of what we do, we will welcome you. I mean, I don't know of any museum professional or organization, in at least in my world, that would put up more barriers. If anything, people will take down as many barriers as they can to welcome you into the industry.
And I think I always found that when I was hiring people, I always hired enthusiasm over experience. I always wanted to hire somebody that was excited to work there and excited about what we were doing over somebody who had a lot of experience but was like, somebody, I have to have a job or I have to be here. I'm always going to hire the person that has the enthusiasm because I can teach you experience. I can't teach you to be excited to be here. So, Lindsay, what about you? What advice would you give somebody who's interested for a job, or a person with a disability who's interested in a job in a museum?
Apply. I mean, go for it, and ask for accommodations along the way as needed. And I found that, so when I worked for the Children's Museum, I learned all about universal design because Jen, you used to have that in our volunteer trainings and our new employee trainings. And that has stuck with me for 15 years now. That, what helps someone with a disability might also help 20 other people who don't necessarily have that same disability. So if you're asking for an accommodation, you might not be the only one who needs it. So for me, for my organization, for my institution to figure out a way to make that accommodation possible, we're probably going to be making a difference, not just in the life of the person asking for the accommodation, but a lot of other people as well. So what's the downside?
And then Carrie?
Been actually going through this with our volunteer and soon to be returning intern. That's exactly what we told them, is just go for it. Just apply, apply, apply. And we offered, since we have experience working with him, that if anybody had any that he was applying for in an interview, if anybody had any questions about working with him through, as being deaf, that we would be right there to as a reference or whatever he needed, to let whoever he's applied to know that it is not a problem. There's not something that is it's not really a challenge at all. It's just after working with him for just a few minutes, it's as easy as we're speaking. It's no hurdle to overcome at all. And although I'm not sure if he's had, it's hard to tell with this in this industry whether rejections have come because of that or not. I hope not, but that's we're basically told him the same thing: just keep applying, and it'll come.
I think that does bring up a point, Carrie, is that the first museum job is the hardest one to get. After you have that first 2-year job, all the other ones are a lot easier to get. It's like that first 2-year job. Once you have that first 2 years of experience, it's like the next ones are so much easier to get, but that first 2-year experience it can be challenging to get to. I feel like that's why sometimes it really is, when you talk to people, a lot of times people do volunteer into a job at first, because unfortunately, unpaid internships are still very common in the museum world, or volunteering into a job is still very common. Also, things like working at a summer camp into a full-time position, or part-time job into a full-time position is also pretty common. So we're going to open up for questions as well, but there is a question that was sent to me. What less visible accommodations have you guys seen, such as volunteers or staff who have sensory issues or concentration issues, or might need extra time completing tasks? And have you found museums willing to hire employees with those types of needs? So I'm going to let any of you answer that question.
Well, we've had a staff here that is on the spectrum as an adult, it's everybody thinks autism, they think of children and everything, but it's with you your whole life, and there, while you think about direct accommodations with people who might have sight problems or mobility problems, there's also, or challenges, I should say, there's also the challenge of, people who's, might be on the spectrum, might have autism. And I think, for us anyways, there's, when you talk about accommodations for those individuals, and in particular this individual, it all came down to communication and management style of their supervisor. One, I think the biggest thing is making sure that person feels comfortable and that they are given responsibilities that, they're not challenged to complete because of the disability that they might have. And sometimes it can be tricky, but if you have, if you have the right frame of mind, but also the ability to communicate, and that person can communicate back as well and what they need, then ultimately I think it will be successful, and it was for us.
I think it also depends on the job that the employee is applying for. Somebody who has sensory integration issues and can get hyperstimulation probably is not going to do well on the ch floor of a children's museum because let's be honest, it's overwhelming for everybody. It's sensory stimulation to the nth degree. So that is probably not the right position for that person, but that doesn't mean that they won't be successful at that museum. That might just not be the right position for them. I think that people can find the right job for them at a museum. It's just finding the right position for them. So I'm thinking also like somebody who might be overwhelmed with sensory stimuli, they might do very well in a collections management position. I think about somebody who really needs to focus on accessioning an object and really needs to be able to focus on every detail of an object. They may do very well in that position where they can see every single tiny detail of an object. And someone who likes to be in a noisy situation will not do well in that position. So I think where somebody might see that as a negative in a personality, it's a positive in that personality and in that position. So I think finding the right role is so important because somebody who likes to be up and moving around a lot, they're going to do great on a museum floor. They might not do great in a collections management position. So I think it is so important to find the right role for you in a museum. Every job is not going to be right for every person. So I think it is important to find the right position and the extra time completing the task. I think it also depends on the type of manager that you have and whether your jobs are clock in, clock out, or whether it's project based. So if you have a manager where it's like you get your jobs done whenever you need to get them done and take as much time versus somebody who's like you clock in at 8 o'clock and you clock out at 5 o'clock, that's going to be a different type of manager. I mean, most museums, I find it's project based. You get your work done and you are there until it's done type thing. So I don't think people who need extra time, that's really that much of a challenge in the museum world. But yeah, I think just finding the right duties, I think is the most important thing. Would you guys say the same thing?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So say one thing that I say to all my interns and all my mentees and anybody that I work with is that it's really great to figure out what you don't like doing and what you're not successful at as well. That's really good information, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you failed or that you're a failure or that you're bad at anything. It just means that that wasn't the right role for you. And great, now you know for the future not to apply for, guest services manager at a children's museum.
Yeah. Accessioning money like I had to do at the North Carolina Collection Gallery drove me absolutely insane because if I had to look at one more Confederate dollar bill, I was going to lose my mind because they all looked the same to me. But having to look at every single rip, for some people that would be great. For me, was not right. So there's another question of their students are very concerned about the rise of AI and whether a chosen career path will still be viable within the next 10 years. How do you think AI is going to be impacting the museum field?
There was a
I could
great
take this one.
story.
All right, Carrie.
Oh, sorry. Just because there has been a huge push in the Department of Defense for us to use AI, they have put it into all of our computer systems. One thing I've done is, like I mentioned, my director has been in this museum for a very, very long time. So as she gives tours, I've been recording her, trying to get a brain dump, all the knowledge she has. Um, and so I transcribe those and then I stick them into the AI and let it do the summaries. And I've done this with tour transcripts. I've done it with social media posts. I've put in, just what I want to say, and hey, give me some examples of how I can make this for Facebook or Instagram, and it'll spit stuff out. So there's a use for it. I don't know. It can't necessarily replace collection work, the hands-on stuff. Maybe ways to better write descriptions or something. I can't think of a way for the collection work itself it will replace. But I think there's space for it and using it for other things.
Lindsay?
There was a great data story that came out today just about AI in museums, and it was the results of a survey, 2,000 respondents, asking them, how do you feel about AI in museums? And the results were really interesting. And what they basically confirmed is that people see museums as inherently trustworthy, and the thought of museums using AI to generate exhibits lowers the trustworthiness of museums. So I think, there's going to be opportunity to incorporate AI in your brainstorming or in, I don't know, cleaning up your language or something like that.
Right.
But people are really good at doing what we do in museums. And I think people are going to keep doing that for a while.
I think also, especially with giving tours, like the human aspect of giving tours, the human aspect of teaching programs, the human aspect of teaching the studio programs, I think the human aspect part of it is not going to go away. Is AI going to help with potentially writing some of the social media posts, potentially writing some of the exhibit text? Yes, but definitely with writing some of the grant writing things. I know a lot of people use AI to help with some of the grant writing now, but I don't think, it's going to necessarily get rid of 90% of the museum field. I think it might get rid of 10% of the museum field. I don't think it's going to get rid of 90%.
I agree.
Any other questions? Well, I want to say a big thank you to our three awesome experts today who are also three great friends of mine. And thank you guys so much for sharing your expertise with us today. And it's also like a little bit of a reunion for us. So, and thank you to our guests for coming today. And again, we will be putting this online for any students who are interested in careers in museums. And everyone have a great rest of your evening. Thank you guys so much. All right.
Bye.
Thanks.
I